A report from Group 17 by Robert C. O'Brien, Chapter 4. Helmut Schultz, Fergus O'Neill said. Yes, he was a student of Gemini's in Italy, a German. He ran a 4-year series of experiments and wrote a paper, a book really. What was it? Virus and Heredity? I read it. Almost, said Colonel Attenborough. It was genetics and virology. Right, the experiments were ingenious, brilliant, I guess. But he made some pretty wild claims, growing feathers on rabbits, something like that. Not quite. By altering genetic cells with injections of virus into the nucleus, he induced changes in bone structure, hair, pigmentation. He claimed these mutations were passed on through 10, 12 generations. He offered pictures to prove it. But some of his more conservative colleagues still didn't believe it. Now they probably would. But that was in 1937, before anybody ever heard of DNA. Fergus said. He was, if he really did it, altering the DNA without even knowing it existed. Don't be too sure he didn't know about it. Or don't be too sure he didn't know it. I reread his book the other day. He had an uncanny intuition. He described how the DNA works almost perfectly. He just didn't know what it looked like. Anyway, they laughed at him. They got pretty sarcastic in some of the scientific journals. He turned sour. Just then the Nazis came along. They picked him up, made him their boy. They wanted him to breed super soldiers. They're not the only ones to have that idea, said Fergus dryly. No, but as far as we know, they're the only ones who ever did anything about it. They put Dr. Schultz in a fancy laboratory in Munich and gave him everything he asked for. And for rabbits, they substituted people, at first Jews, then Polish prisoners of war, mostly women. I'd forgotten, said Fergus. He wrote another paper about that. Not a very scientific one. Experimental use of the Untermensch. I read that one too, or excerpts from it. An almost ranting defense of the idea of using human beings as laboratory animals. Sacrifice the weak to make the human race stronger. The Poles were the weak, the Untermenschen. The Germans were the human race. You have a good memory. That's about all I remember, except that he died at the end of the war somewhere in East Germany. It was in Silesia. He was running a laboratory next to a concentration camp. There were rumors he was producing zombies, making his own submen. And he didn't exactly die. The Russians overran Silesia, blew up his lab. He disappeared and was presumed dead. The presumption was wrong. Are you saying he's still alive? He can't still be working. He hasn't published anything in 25 years. Not under his own name and not for circulation to a very wide audience. Does the name Vasilovsky mean anything to you? Not a thing. Sounds like a Russian. Marshal Dubrev Vasilovsky is, normally at least, in charge of biological warfare for the Soviet Union. I say normally because we think his appointment may have been just a sop for the Red Army. You see, in Russia, the army doesn't control germ warfare. Not this branch of it, at least. It's under the KGB, the Ministry of Intelligence. In any case, that doesn't really matter. Russian research on biological warfare, when reported, appears under Vasilovsky's signature. The individual scientists or teams who did the work are identified only by numbers. Perhaps they prefer that. The reports are top secret and, as I said, don't reach a very large audience. Most of the work is done in a group of laboratories at a place called Novokuznetsk in southern Siberia. It's not a place that one can visit freely. And Dr. Schultz is there. He was there. He isn't anymore. Fergus O'Neill, still sitting behind his desk, tilted his chair back. He opened a drawer, took out a paper clip, turned it in his fingers, put it back, and shut the drawer. Colonel Attenborough, I will admit that the conversation has been interesting so far, but it doesn't seem to be getting anywhere, does it? Can you tell me straight out what all this has to do with me? It has this to do with you. Dr. Schultz is here in this country. He's working in a laboratory near Washington, D.C. We want to find out why and what he's doing. To do that, we need your help. Surely he's not here legally, and no Nazi. Wouldn't he be a war criminal? At least an undesirable alien. He is not here legally. In fact, officially, he is not here at all. Then why not just arrest him, ask him what he's doing, then kick him out? There's nothing I'd like better, but as I said, it's a State Department thing, and they say we can't touch him. Why not? It takes some telling. Do you know the city of Washington? I've been there a few times looking for money. Have you ever been up the Potomac River? No. Wait, yes. Some friends took me sightseeing once up to a waterfall about 10 miles upstream. The Great Falls of the Potomac. Above that, the river broadens out, then narrows again, then backs up into a good-sized lake. Seneca Lake, they call it. Most of the land on both sides is in woods, and the plan is to keep it that way, as national park. But one big stretch, just at the lower neck of the lake, has a history of its own. Is that where Dr. Schultz is supposed to be? It is. About 1910, the Russian government sent a new ambassador to Washington. He was a cousin of the Tsar, a Count Alexander Orlov, or Orloff, something like that. He was rich, of course, and he couldn't stand Washington. It was too hot for him. So he bought several hundred acres of riverfront land about 20 miles out of town, had a private road laid into it, and built an enormous house, a castle. He called it Villa Petrograd. It even has onion domes like the Kremlin. He lived there and came to town, to the embassy only when ceremony required it. He built a high stone wall around the place. It's as secure as a fort. And when the revolution came, he just stayed on. He was smart. He had his money in a Swiss bank. Count Alexander died in 1938 and left no heirs. His wife was dead. He had 2 sons, but both were in school in Russia when the revolution came. They never got out. After his death, for several years, the castle just sat there empty. Then an unusual thing happened. A few years earlier, the United States government had officially recognized communist Soviet Russia for the first time. A new Russian embassy opened in Washington. The new ambassador, a communist named Gershenkin, claimed Villa Petrograd for Red Russia. He said since it had been built and used by the former ambassador, it was Russian government property. It was an odd claim and wouldn't have stood up 5 minutes in court, but it never got to court. What Gershenkin wanted, it turned out, was a country. What Gershenkin wanted, it turned out, was a country place where he and other Iron Curtain embassy people could go on weekends. As it happened, our embassy in Moscow was looking for the same kind of place, so a deal was worked out. We acquired a state on a lake 30 miles out of Moscow. They got Villa Petrograd. It's got something like 120 rooms. Part of the deal was that both places have the status of an embassy, foreign soil. American police, FBI, you name it, can't stick a toe inside the grounds of Villa Petrograd without violating diplomatic immunity. I get it, said Fergus O'Neill. Even if you know Dr. Schultz is in there, you can't get at him. Not unless he strays outside the grounds. Presumably, he knows that, and so far as we know, he hasn't strayed. In fact, no American, State Department, FBI, nobody has actually seen him. Then what makes you think he's there at all? Because of some extremely reliable information from Kuznets, and because of some odd things that have been happening at Villa Petrograd. The odd things have to be considered in the light of one overriding fact. Just downstream from the villa, the city of Washington taps the Potomac. That's where all the drinking water comes from. Giving as an excuse a non-existent headache, Dr. Schultz left Georg Wolter in charge of the afternoon's duties in the laboratory. The work was routine in any case, renewing the nutrient for the cultures, recording their condition, checking temperatures in the incubators, then analyzing today's water samples from the river for chemical and biological variations, checking the thermograph and hydrometer for temperature and rate of flow of the water. Endless and boring work, but essential, more valuable than the stupid tests on the apes. He started from the laboratory as if he were heading for the big house, the villa, where he had his quarters. No need for Georg to know where he was going. Then, as soon as he was out of sight of the building, he left the small asphalt walkway and turned right through the woods. It was a beautifully kept forest. He would give his Russian hosts and their groundskeepers credit for that. Lofty, wide-spreading oaks, shadowy, well cleared of underbrush. Like the Walder, At home in Germany, he enjoyed the walk to the gate. Opening it, again just enough to slip through, he scanned the road in both directions. No one. He pulled the heavy gate shut behind him. Unless someone pushed it hard, there was no way to tell from outside that it was unlocked. He turned right and walked down the road a short distance toward the aspen tree. About halfway between the gate and the tree, he turned left off the road, up the small embankment, through some dusty bushes, and into a rather scrubby woods across from the wall. He picked the spot from which he was unlikely to be seen, but from which he could see the gate, the aspen tree, the wall, and most of the road. He sat down, waited, and watched. In approximately half an hour, which was, on the doctor's Russian-made stainless steel watch, 5 minutes past 4, he saw a bicycle come coasting down the hill, bumping over the rough road. On it rode a girl, he had been right, with light brown hair hanging straight around her shoulders. Age, he would guess, 12 or 13. She wore blue jeans neatly patched at one knee, and on her feet narrow white sneakers. She drove the bicycle past where he sat. She stopped, dismounted, and concealed it behind a bush. Then, walking softly, she went to the aspen tree. She climbed it as easily as a ladder, disappearing into the foliage, then reappearing near the top, her head and hair level with the edge of the wall. Cautiously, she inched higher until she was looking down at where the laboratory must be. Dr. Schultz thought she would not continue looking very long, since today there would be nothing to see but the buildings. Georg would be in the main laboratory underground. He also thought, from the extreme caution with which she moved, that she was aware she might have been overheard on her last visit. He was right on the first point, at least. In fewer than 5 minutes, her head disappeared among the leaves, and she climbed back down the tree. Somewhat less stealthily than before, she took her bicycle from the bushes and rode off. He was ready to stand up when he saw that she had stopped at the gate. Had she somehow perceived that it was unlocked? But no, she merely walked close to it, laying her bicycle down, and peered for a long moment through the crack between the two doors. Still, of all her actions, to Dr. Schultz, this last was the most interesting. And that is the end of chapter 4.